everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. And today's contract tip is we are continuing on with the financing contingency, but we're switching gears a little bit. So today I want to talk about after the financing contingency time frame has passed and a buyer did not terminate based on that contingency, what are the seller's options? What can the seller do to get a little more confidence in the buyer's financing? Well, that is all spelled out in the financing contingency exhibit. At least it is in the GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors version. The verbiage what I'm about to go over is not included in the RE forms portion of the financing contingencies. But if you will read in the Georgia Association of Realtors financing contingency exhibits, it has in paragraph 7, right of the seller to request evidence of the buyer's ability to close. So what it says is if the financing contingency ends, just like I said, the time frame, those number of days from binding agreement date that the buyer and the seller negotiated, that has passed. We're past that and the buyer did not terminate. Then it says the seller shall have the right, but not the obligation, but the right to request that the buyer now provide the seller with written evidence of the buyer's financial ability to purchase the property. A copy of a loan commitment letter from each institutional mortgage from whom the buyer is seeking mortgage financing to purchase the property, stating the type, amount, and terms of the loan. So the type of the loan, the amount of the loan, and the terms of the loan, and the conditions of the funding of the loan shall be deemed as sufficient evidence. The provision of such evidence is not a guarantee that the mortgage loan will be funded to that buyer and that buyer will close on the purchase of the property. The buyer shall have 7 days from the date the seller delivers notice requesting the evidence. So basically, again, we're past the financing contingency time frame. The seller then sends a notice, a written notice signed by the seller. This is not an agent-to-agent email. This is a notice sent by the seller, signed by the seller, requesting evidence of the buyer's ability to close. The buyer then has 7 days after receiving that notice to deliver this evidence. Basically, it's a loan commitment letter from a lender with whatever conditions are left in underwriting to close the loan. The seller cannot make this request if it's within 7 days of closing. But if you're after the financing contingency time frame and prior to 7 days before closing, the seller has the right to request this. So what happens if the buyer's lender never sends over that loan commitment letter? Well, then the next paragraph, paragraph 8, talks about what the seller has the right to do, and it's the seller's right to terminate. In the event the buyer fails to provide the seller with the evidence of the buyer's ability to close, in other words, the buyer fails to give this seller this loan commitment letter from the lender with conditions within the time frame as we just talked about, then the seller shall notify the buyer that the buyer is in default and give the buyer 3 days from the date of delivery of the notice to cure the same. If the buyer does not timely cure the default, the seller may terminate this agreement within 7 days thereafter due to the buyer's default upon, again, notice to the seller. If the seller doesn't terminate, then the right to terminate is waived. So again, in the Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, anytime it talks about default, it talks about if there is a default in the contract, there must be notice given of that default, a time frame to cure, and then the other party's right to terminate is limited by a time frame. But that is spelled out in every issue of default in this contract. So basically, this is a couple things to go over. If the buyer does not terminate under the financing contingency, and I've done several videos on that, please watch those. Then the seller says, okay, now show me the evidence that you can close in the form of a loan commitment letter from the lender. Now, it does specifically state the loan commitment letter must state the type of loan, the amount and the terms, so forth and so on. Now, notice it's requesting that as opposed to what was written and agreed to on the front page of the financing contingency. As I mentioned in the other videos, the loan that the buyer is protected if they terminate under the financing contingency the terms of that loan is not necessarily the same terms of a loan that they're going to use to purchase the property. That's just if they choose to terminate. So now, who does the seller request this from? Well, if you go back to the first page of the purchase of the loan contingency exhibits, it has a place for an approved mortgage lender when the buyer and the seller are first negotiating through this financing contingency. We've again have talked about that in previous videos. If the buyer and the seller go binding using this exhibit and there is no approved mortgage lender identified at the time they go binding, then it does state, and you buyer's agents, y'all need to be aware of this, it does state that when the buyer does know which lender they are going to use and they send their intent to proceed to that buyer. Well, let me just read it. It's paragraph 4, and it says, when it is known, the buyer shall promptly notify the seller of any mortgage lender to whom the buyer has sent notice of intent to proceed with the loan application and the name and contact information for the loan originator. So basically what this states with this paragraph and the previous paragraph is the seller will have the contact information and name of the lender that the buyer is using to pursue a loan to purchase this house. If it is not identified when the parties go binding with the approved mortgage lender, then as soon as the buyer does select a mortgage lender, the buyer is to notify the seller of that intent to proceed. Buyer doesn't terminate, goes on, seller has the right to request the evidence. There are time frames in there, and then the seller has the right to terminate. So this is really in there so that the seller gets some peace of mind or some confidence as to the status of the process that the buyer is going through to pursue the loan if they are getting a loan to close the property. What you as agents need to be careful of is you need to look at these time frames, because again, you have to go past the financing contingency time frame, then the seller sends notice, then the buyer has 7 days from the date of notice to provide the evidence. If the buyer doesn't provide that loan commitment letter within those 7 days, then the seller sends notice of default. Buyer then has 3 additional days to cure the default. Then the seller has 7 days thereafter to terminate or go through or not terminate. So if the buyer and the seller negotiate a closing that is 30-ish days from binding agreement date, and a 21 or 28 day financing contingency time frame, although this verbiage is in there for the seller to request as evidence, you might end up running out of time frame because the closing date will have come and gone before all of those time frames kick in. Also, just in general, agents, as you guys are going along throughout the course of the time from when the buyer and the seller go under contract through closing, y'all need to be in really good professional communication throughout the time frame, checking on the status of the loan, the status of inspections, the status of the appraisal, where are all of the status of the title search, where are all of these other parties that are involved in closing a transaction between a buyer and the seller. From the time of binding agreement date through closing, where are they in the process of their responsibilities and what they have to do? You need to stay in communication with the lenders, with the appraisers, with the closing attorneys to find out and remind them, okay, you need to work on this, you need to work on this to prevent any delays in the closing. As much as possible, should something come up and it need to be addressed by the parties. So take a look at those financing contingencies. Again, that provision for the seller's request to for the buyer to provide evidence is in the Georgia Association of Realtor Financing Contingency Exhibits, not in the RE form contingency exhibits. Loan. It's not stated in the standard terms. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service innovation, and education.